The next few days passed slowly for Jack, though something inside him felt changed. The ranch seemed quieter again, but not in the same lonely way as before. There was peace in the silence now, a kind of soft calm that came after a storm. Still, there were moments when he found himself looking toward the front door, half expecting to hear a gentle knock or see a car pull into the driveway. He missed the sound of Lily's voice, the way she made the baby laugh, the way she moved around the kitchen like she had always belonged there. Emma was growing fast. She smiled more often now and reached for things with curious hands. Jack talked to her while he worked, telling her about her mother and the stars above their home. The baby didn't understand, but she listened quietly, her big blue eyes following him everywhere. In those quiet moments, he found comfort. Still at night, when he sat alone by the fire, the house felt too big for just the two of them. One cold evening, the wind began to blow again. It wasn't a storm this time, just a soft breeze moving through the open land. Jack was sitting by the fire feeding Emma her warm milk. The flames flickered, throwing long shadows across the wooden floor. The baby's small fingers wrapped around his thumb, and Jack smiled gently. Then, just as he laid her down to sleep, he heard it, a soft knock on the door. He froze. His heart skipped. It couldn't be, he thought. But the knock came again, steady and gentle, just like before. Jack stood slowly, unsure if he was dreaming. He walked to the door and opened it. There, under the porch light, stood Lily. She was smiling shyly, a suitcase by her side, her coat buttoned up against the chill. "Evening, Jack," she said softly. For a long moment, Jack just stared, not believing what he was seeing. Then he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Lily, what are you doing here?" She looked down, then back up at him. "The job didn't work out," she said quietly. "And, well, I couldn't stop thinking about this place and about you and Emma." Jack's throat tightened. "You came back?" Lily nodded, smiling nervously. "If you'll have me, I'd like to stay for a while. I don't have anywhere else to go right now." He stepped aside without saying a word. "You know you're always welcome here." She walked inside, her shoes wet from the dew, her eyes searching the familiar room. The firelight reflected off the wooden walls, and for a moment, it felt as if nothing had changed since the night she first arrived. Emma stirred in her cradle, letting out a small cry. Lily hurried over, picked her up, and smiled as the baby stopped crying almost instantly. "She still remembers me," Lily whispered, her eyes shining. Jack smiled, feeling something in his heart finally relax. "I think she does," he said. They spent the rest of the evening talking by the fire. Lily told him about the job that didn't turn out as she hoped. A cold town, long hours, and people who never smiled. She said she missed the sound of the wind over the fields, the smell of the barn, and the quiet peace of the ranch. Jack listened to every word, his eyes never leaving hers. "You made this house feel alive again," he said softly. "It hasn't been the same since you left." She looked down at her hands. "It hasn't been the same for me either," she said. "I thought I could move on, but something kept pulling me back here. Maybe I belong here more than I realized." Jack didn't answer right away. He looked at the fire, remembering Sarah, remembering all the lonely nights. Then he looked at Lily, holding his daughter with such care and warmth. The ache inside him eased just a little. "Then stay," he said simply. "There's room here for both of you." Lily's eyes filled with quiet tears. "Are you sure, Jack?" "I don't want to cause trouble." He shook his head. "You've done the opposite. You brought light into this house when I thought it was gone for good." That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Lily cleaned the kitchen while Jack added wood to the fire. They didn't talk much, and they didn't have to. The sound of dishes clinking and fire crackling said enough. When everything was done, they sat together on the porch. The stars were bright and endless above them, the air cool and sweet. Lily looked up at the sky. "You can almost feel how big the world is out here," she said softly. "And yet it doesn't feel lonely anymore," Jack nodded. "That's because you're not alone anymore." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their thoughts. Jack thought about Sarah, and how she used to sit on that same porch watching the stars. He imagined her smiling somewhere above them at peace. Maybe, he thought, she had sent Lily to them. The next few weeks were filled with small but meaningful changes. Lily helped around the ranch, cooked meals, and cared for Emma like she was her own. She sang while she worked, and her voice carried through the open windows, mixing with the sound of the wind and birds. Jack found himself smiling more often, talking more, living again. The ranch started to feel alive, truly alive, for the first time since Sarah's passing. Sometimes Lily would join Jack in the barn, helping with the horses. She wasn't afraid of hard work. They would talk and laugh, and even the workers noticed the change in him. "The boss is smiling again," one of them said with a grin. Jack didn't answer, but the truth was plain to see. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Lily stood on the porch holding Emma. The baby's tiny hands reached for the fading light, and Lily laughed softly. Jack came up beside her, his hands resting on the railing. They watched the orange sky together, peaceful and still. "Thank you," Lily said suddenly. "For what?" he asked. "For letting me in that first night and now again. You didn't have to, but you did, and it changed my life." Jack looked at her for a moment. "You changed ours too," he said. "Maybe some doors are meant to open more than once." Lily smiled, her eyes shining in the evening glow. "Maybe you're right." As the night came and the stars returned, Emma fell asleep in Lily's arms. Jack watched them both quietly, the firelight flickering through the window behind them. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man trapped by loss. He felt like a man given a second chance. He stepped inside, added one more log to the fire, and turned back toward the porch. Lily was still there, humming softly to the baby. The sight filled his heart with peace. In the quiet of that night, surrounded by the open land, Jack finally understood that sometimes life takes away to make room for something new. The storms, the loneliness, the pain, all of it had led to this moment. A home filled with warmth again, a baby's laughter, and the gentle sound of a knock that had changed everything. The house that was once filled with sorrow now stood full of light. And though the wind still moved across the fields, it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like life itself, carrying forward the story of a man who had lost everything, and then through one unexpected knock found hope again. The next morning brought a calm that felt new to Jack. The storm had passed and sunlight poured over the wet land, turning every drop of water into silver light. The air smelled clean, the sky was wide and clear, and for the first time in many months Jack felt something like peace inside him. He stood on the porch with his coffee cup in hand, watching the horses grazing quietly near the fence. Inside the house he could hear the faint sound of laughter. Lily was talking softly to Emma, and the baby's giggle rose above every other sound. Jack turned his head toward the door, a small smile touching his face. He hadn't heard laughter in that house for so long. When he walked back inside, Lily was sitting on the floor, holding a wooden rattle in front of Emma. The baby waved her tiny hands and kicked her feet with joy. The sight warmed Jack's heart in a way words couldn't explain. "You're good with her," he said again, standing by the door. Lily smiled and looked up. "She makes it easy. She's such a sweet baby." Jack sat down at the table, glancing at the small breakfast Lily had prepared, eggs, bread, and coffee. He couldn't remember the last time someone had made him a meal. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. "I wanted to," she replied. "You've done so much already. It's the least I can do." They ate together while Emma played beside them, and the house felt alive again. The loneliness that had once filled the walls was now replaced by the soft rhythm of conversation, laughter, and warmth. Jack found himself speaking more than usual, telling her about the ranch, about the horses, and about Sarah. He didn't know why, but Lily was easy to talk to. She listened with care, never interrupting, and her eyes were full of quiet understanding. When the dishes were done, Lily looked toward the window. "It's a beautiful day," she said. "Maybe I should check on my car." Jack nodded. "I'll help you. The ground's still muddy, but we can give it a try." They went outside together, and the sun shone warmly on the soaked fields. The air was still cool from the night before, and the ground squished under their boots. They reached the small creek where her car had stopped. It was half buried in mud, but not too badly damaged. Jack fetched his truck and some tools, and they worked side by side, pushing, pulling, and laughing whenever the mud splashed up to their clothes. At one point, Lily lost her footing and fell backward into the wet grass, laughing so hard that even Jack couldn't help but smile. "You okay?" he asked, trying to hide his grin. "I'm fine," she said between laughs. "I think the mud likes me more than the road does." He offered her his hand, pulling her up gently. For a second, their eyes met. There was nothing romantic, just a quiet, warm connection. Two people who understood loss and loneliness finding something simple to smile about. By noon, they managed to free the car. Lily wiped her hands and looked at Jack with a tired but happy expression. "Thank you," she said. "I couldn't have done it alone." Jack nodded. No one should have to face a storm alone. They drove back to the house to clean up and rest. The baby was still sleeping, and the ranch seemed to glow under the afternoon sun. Jack brewed fresh coffee and they sat together on the porch, watching the breeze move across the fields. Lily looked thoughtful for a moment. "You've built a good life here, Jack. Even with everything you've lost, you've kept it going." "That takes strength." Jack shook his head slightly. "I don't feel strong most days. I just keep going because I have to. Emma depends on me." "That's what makes you strong," Lily said softly. "You didn't give up." He didn't know how to reply. For months he had felt like a man moving through shadows, living each day out of duty rather than hope. But now, hearing those words, he realized how much he had survived, and how much he still had left to give. As the day went on, Lily helped around the house without being asked. She washed dishes, swept the floor, and even hung clean sheets near the fire to dry. She moved with quiet energy, and her presence made the house feel warmer, fuller. Jack found himself watching her sometimes, not out of curiosity but out of gratitude. She brought peace where there had only been emptiness. In the evening, after putting Emma to bed, they sat by the fire again. The light flickered across their faces, and outside crickets sang in the cool air. "You'll be leaving tomorrow?" Jack asked, though his voice carried a trace of sadness. Lily nodded slowly. "I should. The road will be clear now, and I'm expected in town for a new job." He looked down at the floor. "You've been a big help here, Emma." "She'll miss you." Lily smiled softly. "I'll miss her too." They sat in silence for a long while. The fire popped and crackled. Jack wanted to say more, but words felt heavy. He didn't want to make her feel guilty for leaving. She had her own life, her own plans. Yet the thought of the house returning to silence again made his chest tighten. Later that night, Lily packed her small bag and folded the blanket she had used. She paused by Emma's cradle, brushing her fingers gently over the baby's soft hair. "Sleep well, little one," she whispered. "You've got a good father watching over you." Jack watched from the doorway, his heart caught between gratitude and sadness. "Thank you, Lily," he said quietly. "For everything." She turned to him with a kind smile. "Take care of yourself, Jack. You're stronger than you think." In the morning, she was gone. The sun rose over the hills and the house felt empty once more. Jack stood on the porch, holding Emma in his arms, watching the road where her car had disappeared. The silence returned, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. There was still warmth in the air, left behind by the kindness she had shared. Days passed, and Jack tried to fall back into his routine. He worked on the ranch, fed the animals, and took care of Emma. But he couldn't stop thinking about Lily, her laugh, her calmness, the way she had brought light into his world for those few short days. The baby often reached for the door as if expecting her to walk through it again, and Jack found himself doing the same, glancing toward the porch whenever the wind knocked against the boards. One evening, as he sat by the fire with Emma asleep in his arms, he realized how much she had changed him. She had reminded him what warmth felt like. She had shown him that kindness could heal wounds that even time couldn't reach. He looked at the photo of Sarah on the mantel and spoke softly. "I think you'd have liked her." Outside, the moon hung high and silver over the quiet land. The ranch was peaceful and the baby slept soundly. Jack leaned back in his chair, feeling both lonely and grateful. He didn't know it yet, but life had one more surprise waiting. Another knock on that same old door, one that would bring the story full circle. For now, though, he closed his eyes and let the silence settle around him, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't done being kind to him. Jack closed the door behind the stranger and watched her quietly as she stood near the fire, warming her trembling hands. The woman looked tired, her clothes soaked from the storm, her hair dripping water onto the floor. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the simple furniture, the rocking cradle, and the small baby sleeping inside. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the fire brought a soft glow that made the moment feel strangely peaceful. "Thank you for letting me in," she said softly, glancing at Jack. "I didn't think anyone lived this far out." Jack nodded, still cautious but kind. "Not many do. Storms like this can surprise you out here." He pulled an extra blanket from the couch and handed it to her. "You can sit by the fire and dry off." You're safe now." She smiled faintly and sat down, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "I was driving to the next town for work," she explained. "My car got stuck near the creek. The rain was too heavy to see, and when I tried to start it again, the engine died." Jack listened, his eyes studying her face. She spoke with calmness, but he could hear the weariness in her voice. "You can stay here tonight," he said simply. "The roads won't be clear until morning." "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "I don't want to bother you." "It's no bother," he replied. "Storm's bad. You'd freeze out there." She nodded with gratitude and looked again at the cradle. "Your baby, how old is she?" "Almost 6 months," Jack said, his tone softening. "Her name's Emma. She's beautiful," the woman whispered. "She looks peaceful now." Jack smiled a little. "Not always. She's been crying a lot lately. I think she misses her mother." The woman's eyes grew gentle. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Jack didn't reply right away. He just stared at the fire, the warmth flickering against his face. "It's been hard," he admitted after a moment. "But I'm trying." The woman nodded slowly, understanding more from his silence than his words. The storm outside roared louder, lightning flashing across the sky followed by thunder that shook the walls. Emma stirred in her cradle and began to cry softly. Without hesitation, the woman stood and walked toward the baby. "May I?" she asked. Jack hesitated, but something about her calm presence made him nod. She picked up the baby gently, holding her close, and began to hum a soft tune, a song that sounded old, warm, and kind. Emma's crying stopped almost instantly. She looked up at the woman, her tiny hands reaching for the edges of the blanket. Jack watched in surprise. He had spent endless nights trying to calm his daughter, but this stranger had managed it within seconds. The sound of her humming filled the small room, blending with the crackle of the fire. It was a simple moment, but it felt like something healing had entered his house. After a few minutes, the woman smiled. "She's a sweet little one," she said softly. Jack nodded. "She seems to like you." "I've taken care of children before," the woman explained. "My sister had 3. I helped her for years before I moved out here for work." Jack rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. He wasn't used to having company, especially not a stranger. "You can sleep in the guest room tonight," he said. "It's small, but it's warm. There's a stove in there, too." "That's very kind of you," she replied. "My name's Lily." "Jack," he said with a small nod. "Jack Miller." Lily repeated his name quietly, almost as if testing how it sounded. "Thank you, Jack. You've really saved me tonight." He shrugged. Anyone would have done the same, but deep inside he knew that wasn't true. Out here, far from town, few people stopped for strangers anymore. Yet something about Lily made him feel she was meant to find his door. The night went on. The storm outside began to fade, but the rain continued to tap against the windows. Jack offered Lily a plate of soup he had made earlier. It was plain but warm. She ate slowly, thanking him after every few bites. Emma slept peacefully in her arms. "You must be tired," Jack said softly. Lily nodded. "I am. It's been a long few weeks." He showed her to the guest room, lighting a small lamp by the bedside. The room was clean but simple. Just a bed, a chair, and a small dresser. "You can rest here," he said. "If you need anything, just knock." "Thank you," she said again, smiling. "Good night, Jack." "Good night," he replied, closing the door halfway before stepping back into the main room. He sat down by the fire, staring at the small flames. The house felt different now, not just quiet, but warm. For months it had been a place of sorrow, filled only with the sound of a crying baby and the echo of his own thoughts. But tonight there was another voice, another heartbeat, another sign of life. He looked over at Emma's cradle and whispered, "Maybe your mama sent her." He didn't know why, but he felt at peace for the first time since Sarah's passing. Hours later, Jack woke to the faint sound of singing. It wasn't the storm this time. It was Lily's voice, soft and clear. She was in the other room, humming the same melody she had used to calm Emma. He stood quietly in the hallway, listening. The tune carried through the house like a memory, gentle and soothing. When morning came, sunlight poured through the windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, shining world. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Jack stepped outside to check the ranch. The ground was muddy, but the fences were still standing and the horses were safe. He fed them quickly, then returned to the house. Inside, Lily was already awake. She had made breakfast, eggs, toast, and coffee. Jack stopped at the doorway, surprised. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I wanted to," she replied with a smile. "You've been kind to me. I just wanted to do something in return." Emma was in her high chair, smiling for the first time in days. Lily was playing peekaboo with her, making her laugh. The sound filled the whole house, light and pure. Jack couldn't help but smile. He sat at the table, sipping the coffee she had made. "You're good with her," he said quietly. "I like babies," she answered simply. "They remind me that there's still goodness in the world." For a moment, they both sat in silence, just listening to the baby laugh and the birds outside singing again. The world felt softer that morning. After breakfast, Lily said she would check on her car once the road dried. Jack offered to help, saying he had tools and a truck if she needed a ride into town. She agreed, and they spent the morning working side by side, laughing a little as they pushed her muddy car out of the ditch. By afternoon, it started again, that quiet feeling between them. It wasn't romance. It was something deeper, something gentle and human, the comfort of two lonely souls finding understanding. When the sun began to set, Lily stood on the porch, looking across the golden fields. "You've built something beautiful here," she said softly. Jack nodded. "I just stopped noticing it for a while." She smiled at him. "Grief does that. But the world doesn't stop being beautiful. It just waits for us to look again." That night, as Emma slept peacefully, Jack found himself thinking about those words. Maybe this was the first real step toward healing. Maybe this woman who had knocked on his door in the middle of a storm had brought back something he thought was gone forever: hope. The days were growing shorter and the air had turned cold and heavy. Jack Miller could feel winter creeping across the plains. Each morning he would step outside and see his breath turning to mist in the air. The grass was pale and dry, and the wind carried a low whistle through the wooden fences. Life on the ranch had always been hard, but now without Sarah it felt harder than ever. Every task felt heavier, every sound louder, and every silence longer. That afternoon the sky began to darken earlier than usual. The wind started to change, coming from the north with a cold bite that made the horses restless. Jack looked up and saw clouds rolling in, thick, gray, and endless. He knew a storm was coming. He could smell it in the air, that strange mix of dust and rain. He walked back toward the house, holding little Emma close against his chest. She was wrapped in a warm blanket, her small face peeking out, her eyes half closed. Inside the house, the air was quiet but heavy. Jack placed Emma in her cradle and started closing the windows one by one. The old wooden frames creaked as he locked them. He checked the fireplace, added fresh logs, and made sure the lanterns were filled with oil. He had been through many storms before, but this time was different. This time it was just him and his baby. The wind began to howl outside, pushing against the walls. The old house groaned, the rafters shaking. Jack lit the fire and watched the flames climb, the light dancing across the wooden floor. He could hear the rain beginning to fall, soft at first, then harder, like thousands of fingers tapping on the roof. He went to Emma's cradle, lifted her gently, and held her close. She started crying, her little hands trembling. He rocked her slowly, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here. You're safe." But the storm grew stronger. Lightning flashed through the windows, lighting up the room for a second, followed by a deep roll of thunder that made the house tremble. The sound scared Emma, and she cried louder. Jack walked in slow circles, his boots creaking on the floor. He hummed the tune Sarah used to sing, the one that always calmed the baby down. After a few minutes, her cries softened. She pressed her face against his shirt, breathing softly. Jack sat down by the fire, rocking her gently. He looked at the small flames, watching the light flicker against the walls. His eyes were tired, but he didn't want to close them. The storm outside seemed endless. Every few minutes, lightning flashed across the wide plains, followed by another crash of thunder that shook the windows. He whispered to himself, "Just another night, Jack. You've handled worse." But deep inside, he felt something different, a loneliness that the wind itself seemed to echo. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Jack stood up and checked the pantry. He frowned when he saw how empty it was. There were only a few cans left and half a bottle of milk for Emma. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I'll go to town tomorrow," he murmured. But the truth was, he didn't even know if the roads would be open. The rain had been heavy for days before the storm hit, and the small bridge near the creek often flooded. He poured the last of the milk into the baby's bottle, warmed it near the fire, and fed Emma slowly. She drank eagerly, her small hands holding onto his finger. Watching her, Jack felt both love and fear. Love, because she was all he had left of Sarah. Fear, because he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to raise her alone. He had faced dust storms, droughts, and long winters, but nothing had ever scared him like the thought of failing his daughter. When she finished drinking, he wiped her mouth with a soft cloth and held her again, feeling her warmth against his chest. The wind outside grew louder. It sounded like something alive crying through the open fields. The old barn doors banged against their hinges, and Jack winced at the noise. "Hold on, little one," he said softly. "I just need to check the barn." He wrapped Emma tightly in her blanket, placed her safely in her cradle, and ran outside. The rain hit his face like cold needles. The yard was a blur of water and mud. He reached the barn, pulled the door shut, and fastened the latch tightly. The horses were uneasy, stamping their hooves and snorting. "Easy, boys," he called out, patting their necks one by one. "You're all right now." He stayed until they calmed, then hurried back toward the house. When he reached the porch, he stopped for a moment, drenched and breathless. Through the storm, he thought he heard something strange, a faint sound almost like a knock. He froze, blinking through the rain. The wind howled again, and he shook his head. "Just the storm," he muttered. But then he heard it again, a soft, deliberate knock on the front door. Jack frowned. No one would be out in weather like this. He stepped onto the porch, his boots splashing in the puddles. The knocking came again, faint but clear. He hesitated, then walked toward the door, water dripping from his coat. When he opened it, cold air rushed inside. At first, he saw nothing but rain and darkness. Then lightning flashed across the sky, and for a split second, he saw a figure standing there, a woman, soaked from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face, clutching a small bag. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking from the cold. "My car broke down near the creek. I didn't know where else to go." Jack stood silent for a moment, unsure what to say. He hadn't seen another soul near his ranch in weeks. The woman looked exhausted, her clothes heavy with rain, her hands trembling. Lightning flashed again, and he could see the fear in her eyes. "Come in," he finally said. His voice was rough from disuse, but kind. He stepped aside, and she entered, dripping water onto the floor. The warmth of the fire filled the room as she stood there, breathing hard. Jack handed her a towel and said quietly, "You're lucky you found this place." "The storm's getting worse," she nodded, still shivering. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I didn't mean to intrude." "It's no trouble," Jack replied. "You can dry off here until the storm passes." He walked over to the fireplace, added more wood, and turned back toward her. For the first time, he saw her clearly. She looked young, maybe in her late 20s, with gentle eyes that carried a kind of sadness, the kind that only life's hardships could give. She smiled faintly, but her lips were pale from the cold. Then from the cradle near the fire, a small cry broke the silence. The woman turned her head, surprised. "You have a baby?" she asked softly. Jack nodded. "My daughter, Emma." He walked over, lifted the baby, and held her close, trying to calm her. The woman watched quietly, her expression softening. "She's beautiful," she said. Jack smiled weakly. "She's all I've got." Without asking, the woman reached out her arms slightly. "May I?" she asked. Jack hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She took Emma gently, cradling her as if she'd done it 100 times before. She hummed a soft tune, a melody that floated through the quiet room. Within moments, the baby stopped crying and looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Jack stared, amazed. "You're good with her," he said. The woman smiled faintly. "I used to take care of my sister's children. Guess I remember how." Jack watched them, the stranger and his child, sitting by the fire as the storm roared outside. For the first time in a long while, his house didn't feel so empty. The sound of rain and thunder faded behind the soft rhythm of her voice as she sang to the baby. And as he looked at them, he felt something he hadn't felt in months, a quiet, fragile hope beginning to stir inside his heart. Jack Miller had everything that a man could dream of. He was a cowboy who had worked his whole life building his ranch, raising cattle, and turning dusty land into a place of pride. People in town called him the millionaire cowboy, not because he bragged or showed off, but because he had earned his wealth through sweat, storms, and honest work. His wife Sarah had been his heart. She was the light in his lonely world, the one who brought laughter to the big wooden house, and she made every sunset feel warmer. But when she passed away after giving birth to their first child, everything beautiful in Jack's life seemed to fade away. The days after her passing were long and silent. The ranch that once echoed with her laughter now felt like a desert. Jack spent his mornings feeding the horses and checking the fences, but his mind was always somewhere else. Every small thing reminded him of her. The rocking chair she used to sit in, the teacup on the counter she forgot to put away, the photo of her holding the baby only days before she was gone. Sometimes he caught himself talking to the walls, whispering her name when the night got too quiet. His baby daughter Emma was only a few months old. She had Sarah's blue eyes and soft smile, but she cried often. Jack tried everything, rocking her gently, singing off-key lullabies, warming milk. But the nights were always hard. He would sit beside the old fireplace, his hat resting on the table, staring into the flickering flames as he held Emma in his arms. Sometimes he whispered to her, "Your mama loved you more than life itself." But the baby was too small to understand. She only cried softly, searching for a warmth that Jack could never replace. He had money, yes, but money meant nothing now. The ranch hands tried to help in the first few weeks, offering to take care of the baby while he worked, but Jack refused. He wanted to do everything himself. It wasn't pride, and it was love and guilt too. He felt he owed it to Sarah to be the one who fed their child, changed her, and watched her grow. The men on the ranch kept their distance out of respect. They had seen strong men break under less. Jack had always been quiet, but now his silence carried the weight of a storm. The house had once been a home filled with the smell of Sarah's cooking and the sound of her singing. Now it smelled of cold air and baby milk. The clock ticked too loudly. The floorboards creaked when he walked, reminding him that he was alone. Every night he would put the baby in her small cradle and sit on the porch outside. The stars stretched endlessly above the open land, and sometimes he imagined Sarah was among them, watching over him and the child. But even that thought couldn't stop the ache in his chest. Some nights he barely slept. The baby would wake crying, hungry or scared, and Jack would get up, his eyes heavy, his heart heavier. He would heat the milk slowly, holding Emma close as she drank from the bottle. When she finally closed her eyes, he would whisper, "You're my whole world now, little one." Then he would sit there long after she fell asleep, afraid to close his own eyes in case the silence swallowed him again. One morning, after another sleepless night, Jack walked out to the barn with Emma wrapped in a blanket against his chest. The sun was rising, painting the sky in gold and pink. The horses stirred in their stalls, their breath turning to mist in the cool air. He fed them quietly, humming the tune Sarah used to sing. The animals seemed to understand his grief. They moved gently, as if not to disturb his thoughts. He looked down at Emma's tiny face and smiled faintly. "You'll grow up here," he whispered. "You'll learn to ride just like your mama wanted." The townsfolk hadn't seen much of Jack since the funeral. Sometimes they spoke kindly about him when they gathered at the cafe. "He's a strong man," the sheriff would say, "but even strong men need someone." Others shook their heads, saying he should hire help, maybe a nanny. But Jack didn't want a stranger taking care of his child. He believed no one could love her the way Sarah would have. He couldn't bear the thought of someone else holding his baby the way his wife had. So he stayed home, working just enough to keep the ranch running and spending every free moment with Emma. Winter came early that year. The nights were colder and the wind howled across the fields. Jack gathered wood for the fire, wrapping his coat tighter around Emma whenever they went outside. He tried to cook simple meals, soups, eggs, bread, though most nights he barely ate. He was losing weight, his face more lined than before, but his eyes softened whenever he looked at his daughter. She gave him a reason to keep going, even when everything inside him felt broken. Sometimes, when Emma was asleep, Jack would take out an old photo album. He'd sit by the fire, flipping through the pictures of happier times. The wedding day, the first calf born on the ranch, Sarah laughing in her summer hat. He'd trace her face with his finger and whisper, "I'm doing my best, darling. I hope you're proud." Then he'd close the album and sit quietly, the only sound being the fire crackling and the baby breathing softly in her cradle. Days turned into weeks, and the loneliness deepened. Even the sunlight felt different, colder somehow. Jack tried to fill his days with chores, fixing fences, mending saddles, anything to keep his mind busy. But the nights always brought memories. Sometimes he dreamed of Sarah calling his name, and when he woke, the emptiness beside him hit like a wave. He'd look over at Emma's cradle and remind himself that he still had someone to fight for. Then came a morning when he realized the milk had almost run out. He stared at the half-empty bottle on the counter, his heart sinking. He hadn't been to town in days, maybe weeks. He didn't want to see the pity in people's eyes. But now he had no choice, and the baby needed food. He put Emma in the truck, wrapped in her little blanket, and drove the long dirt road into town. The wind whipped through the open windows, and he sang softly to her to keep her calm. It was the same lullaby Sarah used to hum, the only song he remembered by heart. At the small store, people looked surprised to see him. The owner, an old friend named Tom, nodded respectfully. "Good to see you, Jack," he said quietly. Jack nodded back, not saying much. He bought milk, diapers, and a few cans of soup. When he reached for his wallet, Tom gently put a hand on his arm. "This one's on me," he said. Jack shook his head and paid anyway. He didn't want charity, just peace. When he returned home, the sun was setting over the hills. He carried Emma inside, warmed her milk, and held her close as she drank. The warmth of the fire touched her tiny fingers and her eyes fluttered shut. Jack looked down at her and felt something shift inside him, a quiet strength returning. He whispered, "We're going to be okay, sweetheart. Somehow we'll make it." Then he sat back in the old chair, rocking gently, watching the shadows dance across the walls. Outside, the wind moved softly across the ranch. The house stood strong against the empty plains. Inside, a lonely cowboy held his daughter close, both of them wrapped in the same quiet hope. He didn't know that soon a gentle knock on the door would change everything. But for now, he was content to sit there, breathing in the scent of baby milk and wood smoke, waiting for the dawn of a better day.